Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be showing you this large female portrait. It was done in a combination of charcoal and a black colored pencil. And this is Rhona Mitra, by the way, a British actress. I've already done a few drawings of her, but I'm going to be taking you through the drawing process now, so let's have a look. The size of the paper is 12 times 17 inches, so it's quite a bit larger than my usual portraits, although it didn't really take that much longer to complete. Like I said, I'm going to be using a combination of charcoal and a black colored pencil mostly, and now I'm using a black colored pencil to complete my sketch. The reason why I'm drawing a portrait of this actress again is because it's a commissioned drawing, and the same customer that wanted the previous two ordered this one. So it's not like I'm obsessed with the actress, although she did make a nice subject for this portrait. Now let me just say a few words about my approach to drawing her hair here, because the hair is probably going to be the most complex and the most interesting part of the portrait. I'm using a tapered stroke basically, and I'm using a medium charcoal pencil. These are woodless charcoal pencils that I use. You can use any brand, but I prefer woodless charcoal pencils because they tend to be easier to sharpen. So I'm using a tapered stroke because that way it's easier for me to create seamless transitions when I'm drawing hair. Because the thing is that once you start blending that hair with a brush, the texture will still remain. Now when you have curved areas like here at the top, you can just do the same thing using a tapered stroke, but you make your strokes from a different direction and kind of try to connect them together at the middle, making a seamless transition so that you don't create a mess and so that you don't create a texture that doesn't really look like nice straight neat hair. Like I said, I'm just going to be using a tapered stroke for most of the hair here, and right now it doesn't look very convincing, but I'm just laying down the basic work, which is going to start to look a lot better when I start using my blending tools. Now the blending tools that I'm going to be using most of the time are brushes, and I tend to use pretty hard bristle brushes for this. Now some people complain that this kind of damages the paper a little bit, and that's true to a certain extent, but I don't really care too much because I like to use slightly thicker paper that can take a little bit more abuse, and it's usually not a problem when working with charcoal. So I use the brush in the same way that I use the pencil, kind of following the direction of my strokes. And it's important to make your strokes in the direction in which the hair is combed, or in the way in which it naturally flows. Because like I said, a lot of this texture remains even when you start blending, and that's why it's important to make your strokes in the proper direction. I also added a little bit of vine charcoal on top to make the whole appearance of the hair a little bit smoother, and to make the transitions from the darker to the lighter areas a little bit smoother. And speaking of darker areas, I'm now using my pencil again to fill in these darker shadow areas in between the segments of the hair. So when you're drawing a hair, regardless of the type of the hairstyle, the hair will always have some kind of a structure, some kind of a shape, and in order for you to make it look more three-dimensional, and in order to give it more depth, you need to create a range of value by breaking that mass of hair into segments. This is especially the case when you have longer hair with women. So it won't just be a whole bunch of hairs. The hair will be broken into several segments, or many segments, and between those segments there will be some shadow areas, and there will be some highlights where the hair is getting more light, because some of these segments are sitting on top of the others, and the ones that are underneath are darker because they are further away from the light source, and the ones that are on top are lighter. So keeping that in mind, I'm trying to create some variation in the value, and I'm adding some darker areas of darker value, and to further increase the range of value, I'm also using a soft charcoal pencil. So far I've used vine charcoal, a medium charcoal pencil, and for a few details here and there I also used a soft charcoal pencil. A soft charcoal pencil is even darker than the medium charcoal pencil, and it allows me to push that range of value even further. I tend to use that soft charcoal pencil very sparingly for some of the darkest areas of my portrait. Her hair here is not very dark, it's kind of brown mostly, but it has some dark shadow areas which I needed to do with a soft charcoal pencil. For most of the drawing process I'm going to be using this medium charcoal pencil. So here I zoomed in a little bit because I'm starting to work on the eyes, and normally experienced artists will advise you to work on both eyes at the same time, so to do the other one right after the first one. I tend to ignore that rule very often, but here I'm going to try to do exactly that. So right now I'm drawing a pupil, and I'm using a soft charcoal pencil because obviously pupils are some of the darkest areas on the portrait, and I'm also trying to leave a little bit of light space for the highlight or the reflection in the eye. So it's very important for me to keep that white area clean, because I want to retain that contrast. So I want that highlight or the reflection to look really shiny. And another thing that I like to do with reflections in the eyes is that you'll often find the reflection covering much of the pupil, or being located exactly in the middle of the pupil. It's usually a good idea to move it just a little bit slightly to the side, and to make it a little bit smaller and simpler in shape. And that way you can have a nice contrast between the pupil and the iris and the reflection. So it's very important to retain that contrast and not to cover the entire pupil with your highlight, or not to have the highlight covering most of the pupil. So we want to make the eyes look as natural as possible. So right now I'm filling in the irises, which are going to be a little bit lighter. Her eyes are, I think, I don't exactly know what color they are, maybe brown, greenish brown, a little bit lighter. And I'm going to do the rest of the details around the eyes with black colored pencil, because here I need some more fine details and I need a little bit more precision. So I'm going to be using a sharp black colored pencil for this. If you're wondering about the brands, because that question is going to come up, some people are just incredibly persistent and incredibly boring when it comes to brands, even though I keep repeating that brands are completely irrelevant, but some people are still going to keep asking that question. The brand of the black colored pencil is Primo. It's a completely unknown brand. You can use any brand you can find. It doesn't really matter. It's completely irrelevant. And the same thing goes for my charcoal pencils. Those are Warris and Woodless charcoal pencils. Again, it's a fairly unknown brand. If you can find some other charcoal pencils, it doesn't matter. It's completely irrelevant. I'm kind of getting tired of answering these questions. I don't know why people think that's important. I don't really know why they think that using one or the other brand will actually help them, but it won't. You just have to practice, and you have to adapt to whatever media you're using. It's the same thing with the type of the paper I'm using. I'm just using some no-name cheap paper that I buy locally. It's fairly thick. It's about 190 GSM, so it's decent thickness, which is what I like, because like I said, I'm not very gentle with my blending tools, and I like my paper to be able to take a little bit of abuse. I'm also using tortillon to work around the eye, and an interesting thing about tortillons is that you can use them as a drawing tool. So sometimes when you don't want to make really strong lines or a lot of contrast, or maybe you don't want to commit to well-defined lines, you can use a tortillon for sketching and for drawing and for making some of the softer edges where you don't have such a clean edge to value. Anyway, now I'm using a softer brush to spread the charcoal around on the face and to establish a base tone before I start shading a little bit more and defining the shape of the face. What I'm actually using here is just the charcoal that I laid down by drawing the hair, so I'm just gently pushing some of the charcoal towards the face, making some very smooth transitions. That way I don't actually have to draw, I don't have to make any strokes at this point. I'm just pushing the charcoal gently from the darker areas to the lighter areas. And if I feel like I need even more value in a certain area, like here on the right, I can just add a little bit of vine charcoal because it's very soft, and I can push that around, creating an area of darker value. That way you can create some smooth transitions. Naturally later I will be adding a little bit of texture to the skin because I don't want it to be completely smooth, but in general when you're drawing either children or younger women, the skin will tend to be smoother, and you want to keep that in mind when shading the face. So as you can see, I've kind of shaded the forehead. Now we have a slightly lighter area around the middle of the forehead, and the area on the right is a little bit darker. And now I'm doing a little bit of shading around the nose, mostly using my tortillon. Again, I don't really want to do this with a charcoal pencil because the marks that it would leave would be too dark and there would be too much texture, so I kind of want to avoid that. So I'm mostly working with my blending tools right now in this stage while I'm shading the face. Now later I will have to reinforce some of these shapes to make them kind of stand out and pop out of the paper a little bit more, but I can do that a little bit later. There will be a stage of this drawing process where the face will look kind of flat, but eventually I will start to define the topography of the face more and more. So I'm still using that black colored pencil to draw some of the finer details around the eyes and the eyelashes and the eyebrows, because I don't think I would really be able to do that as well with a charcoal pencil. I don't think the lines would be quite as clean. And another thing that I like using a black colored pencil too, and a graphite pencil is also good for this, is for these smaller flyaway hairs on the hair, because I don't want the hair to look too neat. So I want to draw a few of these flyaway hairs here and there to break up that perfect straight smooth line of the hair. And that way I can make the hair look a lot more realistic and more natural looking. So I'm just adding a few of these flyaway hairs here and there just to break up that smooth edge and make everything look a lot more realistic. I'm actually trying to integrate the black colored pencil with the charcoal so that it doesn't look like mixed media. So these two mediums are slightly different in terms of their properties, but they can work together really well if you understand their properties. So normally it's better to work with a black colored pencil on top of charcoal, because black colored pencils are kind of waxy, and charcoal requires a little bit of friction. So it's usually better to do the shading first and then put down some of the finishing touches or details with a black colored pencil. But as long as you don't press too hard, it's still possible to shade with the charcoal on top of the black colored pencil. So I find that these two types of pencils integrate really well, and that's why I like doing most of my drawings with them. Here around the mouth we're going to have a few of these highlights, so I'm trying to work around them with my tortillon. I want to leave that white space, but I'm also kind of gently pushing the charcoal towards those lighter areas. I don't want the edge to be too clean. And later I will be adding a little bit more value and texture to those lips. But right now I'm kind of shading some of the line of the mouth and the area around the mouth. And there's also a little bit of hair falling on the side of her face, so I'm going to have to include that as well. So she has some interesting looking earrings, kind of look like flowers or leaves or something. I don't really know what they are, but I'm gonna try my best to imitate their appearance. I also wasn't really sure what to do with the hair on the right, because my reference photo was kind of dark and I couldn't really make out where the hair ends and the background begins, so later I had to improvise a little bit. Now here I'm drawing a few of these segments of hair, and now I'm going to draw the line around the jaw. I'm first drawing that line with a medium charcoal pencil to make it a little bit cleaner and more defined, also a little bit darker. And after that I'm going to add a little bit of vine charcoal to draw that shadow under the chin, and I'm gonna blend that or push that in with a brush. I want the shadow to have a mostly clean edge, but not super clean, so I'm just softening the shadow ever so slightly. I will be modifying it a little bit later because I'm going to have to shade the rest of the neck, but this is just to give myself a rough idea about what it's going to look like. So now I'm going to soften the hair here on the side of the face a little bit, and I'm going to move on with the shading the rest of the face. So what I'm going to do here is, again, I'm going to be using that soft brush and just using the charcoal which is lying around to push it towards the lighter areas of the face, and where I feel like I've pushed a little bit too much charcoal, I can just take away a little bit using my erasers. Usually I need an eraser, but also my pencil eraser. And the right side of the face I think needs to be just a little bit darker, so I'm going to be adding a little bit more value there. So I just keep adding more and more charcoal, mostly applying that with my brush. And she has some nice dimples here on her cheeks, so I'm adding a little bit more value there, and I'm going to probably define them a little bit more with a pencil. Here I added a little more shading to the eyes, because the whites of the eye also need to be shaded so that the reflection would stand out. The reflection in the eye usually needs to be lighter than the whites of the eye. And I'm also adding the lower eyelashes. And now the eyes are mostly complete. I just need to shade around them naturally. I also need to shade around the nose, because if you don't shade the sides of the nose to a sufficient degree, the nose will end up looking either flat or almost non-existent. And another interesting thing is that I think she has some kind of freckles around the nose and on the sides of the nose, so I'm going to add a little bit more texture to that part of the face so that I can make it look as much as her as possible. So I'm trying to achieve as much likeness as possible, so I'm going to include the freckles as well. even though they aren't really that visible in my reference photo, but it still looks like she has freckles, so I'm going to include them anyway. Now I'm shading the lower part of the face and adding some more value on the right side of the face, and I'm using most of the time I'm using a black colored pencil for this work, because I kind of established the base tone using mostly charcoal, and then I went in with a black color pencil to further define some of the facial features. And another advantage of using a black color pencil on top is because it allowed me to create some additional texture, because I don't want the skin to look perfectly smooth, because then it would look kind of unnatural. And if I feel like that texture that I create with a black colored pencil needs to be further softened, I can always use some brushes on top and soften that texture. So it's a back and forth process where I'm working on both the range of value in order to express the shape of the face, and also a range of textures to make it look like a realistic human skin. So here I'm adding a little bit more texture around the nose to make some suggestions of freckles, and I'm also adding a few more details to the hair to make the hair look a little more natural, like it's casting a shadow onto the face and over the eye. And I'm also trying to define this area around the mouth a little bit. She has fairly large lips, and her face is an unusual combination of some, let's say, feminine and slightly masculine traits, because she has a fairly wide jaw and chin. And here I used a pencil eraser to further clean up some of the highlights on the lips. And now I'm doing the same thing with the nose. And as I'm adding some areas of lighter value on the nose, you can see how that part of the nose is beginning to stand out, and we're creating a feeling of depth, and it feels like the nose is protruding towards us. So I'm also going to make this part of the forehead a little bit lighter. Generally, it's always the upper part of the face that's a little bit lighter. So I'm just doing some final shading on the face, but I also added a little bit more value to the hair. And one of the things that I liked about the hair and about the way it came out was because I used a bit of vine charcoal. That upper part of the hair has a lot softer edge, and it was an unintentional effect, but it ended up looking a lot more realistic than I expected. So here I decided to do something about the hair on the right side, because, like I said, in my reference photo I wasn't really sure what was going on there, because the background was really dark and I couldn't really make out where the hair ended and the background began. So eventually I had to improvise a little bit, and I just drew something that kind of made sense to me, and then tried to make everything look more realistic by adding a lot of these flyaway segments and a lot of these flyaway hairs. There's always a lot of cleaning up to be done when you're working in charcoal. That can sometimes be a little bit frustrating for people who are used to cleaner types of media such as colored pencils or graphite pencils, but with charcoal it's just inevitable. So here I'm going to do the hair around the other earring and the other earring, and I'm going to shade it so that it kind of looks like it's made out of metal. So there's a lot of hair here, kind of twisting and falling over her face and her neck. So now I'm trying to define some shapes on her earrings, just leaving out some of the light spaces to make them look kind of shiny, like they're made out of metal, but I don't really need to put too much detail into them. And now I'm just gonna move on to the rest of the body. I need to shade the neck, the shoulders, and the upper part of the chest, as well as her dress. So I'm creating another vignette, so I'm not going to be drawing much of her clothes. I'm just going to start drawing the dress, and I'm going to fade it towards the edge of the paper. So right now I'm just putting some indications of anatomy and kind of putting down a little bit of vine charcoal and spreading that around. And I'm going to be shading more and more to try to define the shape of her shoulders and the neck. I'm also going to be using a black colored pencil for that as well. It's mostly a combination of vine charcoal and a black colored pencil, but for some of the darker shadow areas I'm going to be using woodless charcoal pencil. So I'm not exactly rushing through this, but I am not paying that much attention to it because obviously the face is the most important part of the portrait. But I still have to pay enough attention to the rest of the body so that I don't mess it up, and so that it's not too distracting, and so that it doesn't ruin the appearance of the whole portrait. I like creating vignettes because they allow me to focus on the face when I'm drawing portraits, and it also allows the viewer to focus on the face immediately rather than a whole bunch of unnecessary details. So I'm going to draw some shadows here, shadows which are casted by these segments of hair. I'm going to try to soften them and make them look as realistic as possible. And I'm also going to draw a whole bunch of these flyaway hairs, like I said, just to make the hair look more realistic and less neat. And here I'm starting to work on the frills of this dress, just drawing in some of the darker shadow areas and softening that with a brush. I'm later going to define them a little bit more. I mostly used a piece of vine charcoal for that. I can cover that very quickly with vine charcoal and just try to define these darker areas a little bit later. I've also had to use a pencil eraser to clean up the edges a bit. And now I'm using a black colored pencil again for some of the details on the dress, just to define some of these frills. And give that dress just a little bit more shape, but like I said, I don't really need to put too much detail on it because it's a vignette, and I want the focus to be on the face. I'm putting down some finishing touches on the dress, just adding some darker areas to create a little more depth. And now that I've cleaned up the drawing, it's pretty much done. I'm going to sign it here in the lower right corner. And that's about it. This is what the finished portrait looks like. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other videos. I'm going to see you in the next one. That will be all. Bye for now.